Think about how hard your life is. You wouldn't have made it through a single day in the Middle Ages. We are more flexible now that we have modern conveniences. And the problems that people in the Middle Ages had to deal with every day would shock you to the core. What about the food from the Middle Ages? The things that would make you want to leave. Let's go back to the 21st century. Faster than you can say McDonald's. First, forget everything you've ever seen in a movie about fancy meals with huge turkey legs. The food that most people ate was bland. The diet was boring and often dangerous, like watching paint dry. Most peasants relied on a substance called pottage. It was basically a sad soup, made with whatever crops they could grow and cooked in the same pot for days. In other words, it was like Mum's mystery stew from the Middle Ages. It was hiding weevils instead of vegetables and dirt. Most people got most of their food from bread. The fluffy, sliced thing we like today wasn't the same back then. The bread from the Middle Ages was very thick. It was dark and often full of things that people didn't want. In most cases, the flour was ground between stones before. People used to have stronger teeth and wheels that weren't round. Because of bad genes, but because they kept gnawing on what was really, let me tell you a terrible truth about dough with rocks in it. A lot of the loaves of bread had ergot in them. Ergot is a type of fungus that grows on rye. The hallucinations were caused by ergot poisoning. Some historians think that ergot poisoning might have had something to do with the witch hunt. People who were poisoned felt intense burning, and sometimes even died. State of hysteria, mostly because whole villages would quickly start to see things that weren't there. For example, you might think your neighbor is a witch. The time when your baker only had to clean his tools. For most people, meat was a treat. When they did get food, it was often close to going bad. They used strong spices to hide the smell of spoiled meat when they could afford it. They couldn't use enough refrigeration to do this. If not, you just rested your nose on your nose and hoped for the best. It was a rule that lasted all through the Middle Ages, and it was more like the 5-day guideline. This food is so bad that you couldn't even wash it down with water, because eating it would make you sick. Most water sources were polluted because of human waste. Instead of other bad things, everyone, even kids, drank beer or ale. Not the strong material we have today, but a weaker version that was safer than water because the brewing process killed germs. A study found that medieval peasants drank about 8 pints of ale a day, and kids as young as 5 always had a glass of ale with each meal. Children didn't have to pretend to be IDs to drink in the Middle Ages. Instead, they had to get water. Another popular dish was fatty fish. The usual ways to keep food fresh are to dry it or salt it. Because fresh fish goes bad quickly, people who live by the coast may be able to get fresh fish. People who lived inland got fish that were days or weeks old. The smell alone would knock you out. Your stomach is probably already turning by now. This brings us to the next medieval horror, which is perfect in every way. For most people, using the bathroom meant using a chamber pot. It is basically just a bowl or bucket that is kept under the bed. You could either empty it yourself or wait for someone to come and get it when it was full. Where did they empty it? In medieval times, the phrase, "look out below," meant something other than things falling. It meant looking out the window and into the area below the street. When people lived in towns, it was normal to just shout when they saw poop. Before throwing trash out of upper windows, a bathroom should be set aside. The phrase garde-à-vous comes from the French word for be careful. In other words, be careful around the water. They definitely meant something much less pleasant by waters. This was a very common thing to do. In some cities during the Middle Ages, Trash could only be thrown out of windows. According to the rule, if you were lucky enough to go to a castle after 10 o'clock at night, you would if you find something called a garderobe. It's a hole in the floor of a stone seat where trash was thrown directly down the wall of the castle. Archaeologists found a garderobe with a waist that lowered. Thrones that were almost 70 feet tall may have been used by kings and queens. Still, their bathrooms were just holes in the ground with drafts. For those who couldn't, keep an eye out for their chamber pot to show up at their house. Those choices were not good. There were often designated spots in public places. People would go to these places to relieve themselves, which we now call open sewers. In London, there were places called common privies, built on top of rivers, but there weren't many of these. The job of making collections was to get rid of human waste. These brave people would collect trash from cesspits, which is sad because they are known as gong farmers. Take it outside the city walls. They could only work at night, and the smell was so strong that it stuck to them. They weren't allowed to be in public places where people met. Even though things were bad, gong farmers were paid very well. The smell that came from medieval cities was about 4 times as much as what an average worker made. The River Thames in London was a river because it was so dirty with trash. It was called a monstrous agent of odor, so toilet paper isn't worth mentioning. People used whatever leaves they could find. Their left hand was covered in moss, or, if they were very valuable, pieces of wool or hemp. In the past, the Romans used sponges on sticks. That they used vinegar or salt water to clean their hair. But by the Middle Ages, most of that knowledge had been lost. If you spent a whole day drinking ale to avoid getting sick from dirty water, and then found that there was no good place to go to the bathroom, you would be ready to go back to the 21st century. Still, the bathroom scene was only one of many. The harsh realities that made life in the Middle Ages so difficult were a daily test of one's ability to survive. Forget about those romanticized ideas of what it means to be a brave knight, or a lovely young lady living in a castle. Most people in the Middle Ages worked hard all the time. That is, from dawn to dusk. Farmers made up most of the population, and they only had a little money to live on. People who worked the land that belonged to the nobility got up at dawn every day. You should go to bed after working until dark. Keep happening until one dies. A regular farmer used wooden tools to till the fields. People planted the seeds by hand, and oxen pulled them up. In addition to using simple sickles to harvest crops, peasants worked for 16 hours a day in the blazing sun while the harvest was going on. Documents from England from the Middle Ages show that a typical farm worker would burn more than 4,000 calories in a single day just by doing their job. Farmers didn't need to go to the gym in the Middle Ages. They only had to get through Tuesday. Just for those who don't farm, there were other ways to make a living through skills and crafts. Even though they had their own problems, blacksmiths spent their days in forges filled with smoke, taking in poisonous vapors that could hurt your eyes and skin as well. Tanners made leather by working with animal hides, used urine and other dangerous chemicals that made their skin turn yellow, that made them smell really bad, that went with them everywhere they went, would like to work as a skilled tradesperson to get a head start. Traditionally, apprenticeships started when the apprentice was 7 years old. When children were around, they would be put in the living quarters of a skilled artisan. These young apprentices worked 6 or 7 days a week, to a maximum of 14 years before they could become journeymen. Career advisors in the Middle Ages had a pretty simple "if you can lift heavy things, use this job selection" float. If, in fact, the farmer, if there is no mortality at an early age, certain positions were created with the low-income population in mind. And kids were the link. Guys who were in a lot of trouble. They were carrying torches to light the way. People who were wealthy pure finders gathered dog poop at night to sell to tanning agents. Most jobs pay so little that they don't even cover the basics of life. During the Middle Ages, a day labourer in England could make 1 or 2 pence a day. There was no such thing as a minimum wage, so you could only buy about 2 loaves of bread. The idea was the least amount you need. You would have to make sure you don't die before you finish your work, which would be hard on your body and not give you enough food. There was sickness everywhere. Most of the time, there wasn't any medicine available. What happened to the healthcare system is what we would call torture today. Medieval online MD had one diagnosis for every problem that came up. You are most likely going to die. For a cold or the flu, the best thing to do is rest. And medicine that you can buy without a prescription. This could mean death. People in the Middle Ages thought that bad air quality caused disease because they didn't know about germs or infectious agents. A sickness that affects the bodies for humours, blood, phlegm, or both. There was a fever in both the yellow and black bile. A time for letting blood. To do this, a vein must be cut open. ... and putting the blood into a basin. The medieval medical community had a single answer for every problem. You have too much blood. I'll handle that for you. Leeches were also a common way to treat people. These parasites that eat blood were put on the skin. To get rid of the bad blood, medical literature said that using 70 leeches at once was a good idea. Because of a number of restrictions, disease caused a very high death rate. 30% of kids die before they turn 5. The average age of a person was between 30 and 40 years. The germs that caused the pandemic killed almost half of Europe's people. In the middle of the 14th century, dental problems were especially bad. People didn't know how to take care of their teeth or have toothbrushes, so tooth rot was common. Medieval dentists didn't need to make appointments. They just waited. Mercury was given for everything, and it was often very dangerous, until someone screamed so loudly that everyone in town could hear it, including the medicines that were there. The warning labels on their prescription drugs weren't needed, even though they had skin problems and syphilis. The bad effects were always that they could kill you faster than the sickness itself. The worst part is that a lot of diseases spread. That is what they think of hand sanitizer, because they don't know much about hygiene. They were using their hands to clean their already dirty clothes. This is like trying to clean a shoe that has gotten muddy, even though you have a dirty sock on. Went through all of these medical procedures from the Middle Ages. It wasn't even close to being over for you. The Middle Ages was a time when there were many other ways to make each day a challenge. Justice in the Middle Ages was more than just being blind. In short, it was mean. The administration of justice was based on ideals, which made it unfair and often completely random. That is something that would scare lawyers today. First of all, the rules in each city were very different from each other. In one village, what was perfectly legal could get you thrown into a dungeon. There were no laws that weren't the same for everyone, and the most common thing was that no one knew what was really against the law, to the point where they were accused of breaking it. The right to be punished is yours to use. You have the right to ask for forgiveness. Good luck with that. The sentence doesn't always fit the crime. In England, during the Middle Ages, there were almost 200 different crimes that could get you killed. For example, if you stole food when you were really hungry, you could have your hand cut off. It was against the law to cut down a tree in the king's forest or steal things worth more than 12 pennies. It was nothing like the courts we have today. If you were accused of a crime, you often had to go through a trial by ordeal to prove your innocence. One common way to prove someone's guilt was to ask them to carry a red, irregular iron bar for 9 feet in 3 days. If their burns healed without scarring, they were innocent. If the burns got infected, they were guilty, which would have been almost certain without modern medicine. You were to blame. Most of the time, their idea of a lie detector test was, what do you think, God? Trial by water was another common method that people used to keep this terrible thing from hurting you. They made the decision to tie up the accused and throw them into a river or lake. If you sank, you weren't guilty. People who floated were found guilty and given the death penalty. Because water is a pure substance, the logic would say that the guilty are wrong. There was no way for the accused to win in this situation. For those who have been found guilty, the methods of execution were meant to be as open as possible. Hanging was one of the more humane ways to kill someone, even though it was horrible. Sketching and dividing into quarters, those who were condemned were hauled through local streets by horses, hung till they were almost dead, and defecated while still alive and conscious. After being severed from the cranium and chopped into 4 pieces, they were set apart for the most heinous of offenses. Public executions, similar to those for treason, were community events, attracting large groups that brought their own food and drinks regularly, even to the point of going to a festival. In the Middle Ages, there weren't many options for entertainment. You can see someone being put to death. You could relax at home and look at the wall. The majority of people chose the execution. Nobles didn't have to go to court very often. If a noble were accused of a crime, like a commoner, they might want to fight to prove their innocence by hiring a professional fighter to speak for them. If they were rich criminals, they could also pay victims blood money to avoid punishment. At the same time, low-income people who have been accused of crimes have almost no other options for defense. What about prisons, though? Medieval jails were not meant to keep people in for long periods of time. They were holding cells. Before you could actually be punished, these dungeons were dark, crowded pits. People who were in prison were often chained to the walls or floors. The government didn't bring any food to the people. Family members brought food to the prisoners. They could also just go hungry. The court system often used torture as a way to get information, used for things other than punishment. To get people to confess, though, they used things like the rack, which stretched the limbs until the joints came out of place. A container that looks like a coffin, or the Iron Maiden container with spikes and thumbscrews on the inside. How did they get confessions? By smashing fingers. Is it true or not? Most people will confess to anything to stop the pain. This was the motto of the medieval legal system, in any case, which usually led to execution. It would have been better to either admit it or deal with the pain. You will still suffer, though. People often used public humiliation as a punishment for minors. People who were arrested for crimes were forced to sit in a public square with their heads and hands trapped between 2 wooden boards, while town residents threw spoiled food, mud, and even more at them. Most of the time, women used the ducking stool. They were said to have slandered or fought with their husbands, and they would be strapped to a chair, being underwater many times. During the Middle Ages, the police were also very basic. There weren't any trained police officers there. The towns hired people to watch over them at night. Most of the time, these were older men who were thought to be too old to work. Their main job was to sound the alarm. If you saw a crime or a fire, the medieval police did not read you your rights. They just yelled, "Stop stealing," and believed that one of the people would trip you by sticking out your leg. Even if you didn't do anything wrong, just being accused of a crime could ruin your life. The presumption of innocence until proven guilty was nullified upon accusation, leading to an automatic assumption of guilt. It was also necessary to show that this was not the case. If the legal system didn't kill you while you were going through these terrible things, you might have lived long enough to see another example of medieval warfare-based horror that didn't look like anything you see in movies. Think about the great fights you had with the Shining Knights. Combat in the Middle Ages was very chaotic. People charged over huge fields. Wars broke out all the time, and they were savage situations that were almost certain to kill most people. The war between France and England lasted from 1337 to 1453 and lasted for 100 years. That means there have been 116 years of fighting that hasn't always been going on. Someone who lived during the Middle Ages had to deal with a lot of wars. Many people spend their whole lives without ever having to deal with the conflict. Let's talk about armor, which is only for the rich. Knights could pay for full plate armor. The price of the plate armor was about the same as that of a modern sports car. It was worth 2 to 3 years' worth of salaries for a skilled craftsman. Most of the soldiers wore clothes made of padded cloth, also called gambesons. They may have a few metal plates sewn on. Should they be lucky enough to be knights in shiny armor, people who lived in the Middle Ages and owned expensive sports cars that were rare, putting on a show and probably making up for something more serious. What about the cost of weapons? Swords cost a lot of money. Sparrows were used by common soldiers as well as knights and nobles. The longbow was the most feared weapon of the Middle Ages. It was used for farming or as an axe that had been changed for use in battle. The English longbowmen started training when they were very young. They could get through most armor at close range, making skeletons that are misshapen because of the physical strain of drawing bows that weigh 200 pounds 1,000 times. In the Middle Ages, wars were very dangerous. The Battle of Towton happened in 1461. Every day, about 28,000 soldiers died. The snowfall has killed many people, but less than 1% of the men in England are dead, which was there during the war before they had ever been in a fight. War wounds almost always led to death because of the presence of infection. It wasn't even the battles that were the hardest part of the war, even though they were dangerous for the peasants. This is what armies did when they weren't fighting. The armies of the Middle Ages lived off the land, meaning that they took all the food and supplies they needed. A lot of the time, this means burning crops from nearby villages. Soldiers from both sides of the conflict looted communities, killing animals, and destroying homes. We beg you, please don't use all of our food and set our homes on fire. This is what our soldiers meant when they said that civilians were being left to starve to death during the medieval period. Being under siege was especially terrifying. In the situation in which an army surrounded a fortified town or castle, hunger was a slow death for those who were trapped inside. During the years 885 to 886, when Paris was under siege, people ate rats to stay alive. Over time, cats, and eventually each other. For months, or even years, sieges might be in effect. During the 1600s, there was a siege against Candia. The modern-day Heraclion lasted for 21 years, the longest siege in history. More soldiers died from illness than from actual fighting. Armies were the best places for diseases to spread. The living conditions of thousands of men were bad because there wasn't enough food and water, and the water was dirty. Because of this, European armies often lost half of their soldiers to illness. It took a long time for them to get to their destination. Medieval army medics could use 2 different types of therapy. To heal small cuts, put some dirt on them, and get ready to meet your maker for everything else that is in store for you. People who are stuck in combat zones have to make choices that are not human. To run away, you had to leave your house and things behind. When you travel, you could be at risk of famine. When you stay, you could be attacked by passing forces. There were women and children among the victims. Chronicles from the Middle Ages tell of whole villages being wiped out by slaughter, with no regard for age or gender. If you could find a way to avoid harm, you could join these terrible wars and survive the roaming armies without starving to death. People in the Middle Ages had to deal with famines that caused them to suffer every day. You were the first to smell it. In the Middle Ages, towns smelled like human waste. There were chemicals used in tanning that were bad for the bodies, and food that was rotting. There were also the ruins of a slaughterhouse and smoke from many different events when garbage wasn't picked up. It was thrown into the nearest river. Butchers threw away the blood and guts of animals. The smell was so strong near their stores that it really got to me. People had small bags with different herbs in them, called pomanders, which they were told to hold to their noses. The air freshener used in the Middle Ages worked a little less well. Things that smell bad are used to hide things that smell bad. People were not very clean at all. Most people only bathed a few times a year. Many people thought that taking a bath would open the pores in the spring and at the end of summer, and let sickness get into the body. People can go 4 to 5 months without washing when winter is in full swing. Because head lice were so common, special combs for getting rid of them were common personal grooming tools. Romantic relationship profiles in the Middle Ages would have said, "The lice infestation is only mild." A big selling point was that the clothes were uncomfortable. The rough linen was used to make the underwear, which was rarely washed and worn until it was completely worn out. This made the skin worse. The outer clothes were made of thick wool that itched all day long. The average person owned only 2 or 3 sets of clothes. The shoes were made of soft leather. The shoes had flat soles, which didn't protect them from the weather. It would be very hard to get over because of the language barrier. People spoke Middle English starting in the 1400s. It sounds like a different language is being spoken. A lot of people who speak English today say things like, "Why is it so thin?" So the question, "What is your name?" makes no sense at all. It would be hard for you to understand other people. They would think you were talking nonsense if you talked to them. There was no privacy. One room made up most of the houses, where we all ate, worked, and slept at the same time. Many family members slept in the same beds. When tourists stayed in inns, they would often share beds with people they didn't know. There were always servants in a house, no matter how rich it was. There weren't many ways to have fun, and they were often violent, even when they were alone. There were a lot of people at public executions. And people thought they were parties. Trapping animals, where dogs would attack tethered bears or bulls. People liked choices that were less aggressive. Included watching performers who were on the road, or hearing the stories that bards tell. But these weren't very common treats. There was no room for change in the social hierarchy, and it was cruel. The feudal system gave everyone a certain place to live. This made it very hard for people to move up in society. They made up about 90% of the people, who didn't own any land and worked on land that belonged to aristocrats who were moving up in the world. Changing jobs was also very rare. People believed in superstitions to fill in the gaps in their knowledge, which was limited at the time. They had a lot of faith in witches. People thought that evil spirits caused medical problems, as well as monsters and other supernatural beings. A lack of good air or astrological effects. When there is a solar eclipse, a whole town can go into a state of panic. People in the Middle Ages thought the world was coming to an end. They would ask the oldest person in the village if they had ever seen the same thing before. Communication was slow and unreliable at times. The news spread as quickly as a messenger walking. It could take days for any news about horseback riders who are 50 miles away to get to you. It could take a few months for news to get to you from other countries. If we could find it, our journey through the horrors of the Middle Ages has brought us to this point. You would be doing everything you could to find a place to go back to. Your cozy, modern living, with its antibiotics, deodorant, and plumbing rights for people, might make the past seem romantic in movies and books. The truth is that life in the Middle Ages was always hard. That many of us today can only last for one day.